Aliens discovered human weapon material, were left speechless. The problem started with a sneeze. Not a dramatic sneeze. Not a sneeze that shook the room or caused any kind of scene. Just a small, ordinary human sneeze from a technician named Dara Wells, who was carrying a sealed sample case through the shared corridor on Deck 7, when her nose decided it had opinions about the recycled air filters. She sneezed, the case slipped, the case hit the floor, one of the latches failed. 3 small containers rolled out across the corridor floor and stopped at the feet of Liaison Officer Brent, who was walking the other way. He picked them up without thinking, looked at the labels, and handed them back to Dara. Sen saw this from 12 feet away. Sen was a Vahari First Contact Specialist assigned to Helix 9 for a 6-month cooperative research rotation. He had been on the station long enough to read basic human labeling. He had taken the course. He had passed it. He had even scored well. So when he saw the label on the container Brent handed back to Dara, he understood it correctly. He read it once. He read it again. Then he looked at Dara, who was relatching her case and muttering something under her breath about the floor being uneven. She did not look like someone carrying a hazard. She looked like someone mildly annoyed about a sneeze. Sen went directly to the Vahari section and found his supervisor, a senior analyst named Koru, who was deep in paperwork and not happy about the interruption. Sen explained what he had seen. Koru stopped not being happy about the interruption and became a different kind of unhappy entirely. Within 2 hours, the Vahari team had submitted a formal request to Station Command for a materials review of the human crew sections. Station Commander Rail, human, practical, with the specific brand of patience that comes from running a joint species research station for 8 consecutive years, read the request, read it again, and called Dara Wells into her office. Dara stood in front of the commander's desk with her sample case and the expression of someone who genuinely could not identify what she had done wrong. "The case that dropped in Corridor 7, Rail said. What was in it?" "Supply samples for the materials lab," Dara said. "I am running the friction resistance tests this week." The case had the base compound set, the 2 reactive variants, and the containers with the orange stripe labels. "Yes. Those are what the Vahari flagged." Dara blinked. "The iron sulfide mix, that is a standard test compound. We use it in the friction battery on Deck 4. It has been in the supply catalog since before I joined the station." Rail looked at her for a moment. She had been in this job long enough to know the specific look on a human's face when they genuinely did not understand why something was a problem. Dara had that look. It was authentic. She had not done anything wrong by her own reckoning because, by her own reckoning, she had been carrying ordinary supplies. "Do you know what the Vahari classification level is for iron sulfide compound in this concentration?" Rail asked. "No," Dara said. "Neither did I," Rail said, "until 40 minutes ago. Sit down." Dara sat. Rail turned her screen to show the Vahari materials index. The iron sulfide compound that Dara used routinely in friction battery tests sat under a category label that translated roughly as materials requiring controlled environment handling and restricted transport authorization. Below that, in smaller text, was the note about its primary recorded uses across known galactic species. Dara read it. She read the note twice. "We use this in brake pad testing," she said. "I know," Rail said. "It is in the standard supply catalog. Any technician can request it." "I know that too." Dara looked at the screen. She looked at the classification level. She looked back at Rail with the expression of someone doing math that is not coming out right. "How many of our standard supplies are on this list?" she asked. Rail turned the screen back around. "That," she said, "is exactly the question the Vahari team is here to answer. And I need you to cooperate with them completely and answer every question they have. no matter how obvious the answer seems to you. Dara nodded slowly. She was still thinking about the brake pad testing. They are going to look at the Deck 4 supply room, aren't they? She said. Yes, Rail said. And the Deck 2 general stores. Yes. And the emergency materials cabinet in Corridor 9. Rail paused. What is in the emergency materials cabinet in Corridor 9? Dara thought about it. I will get you a list, she said. Rail closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Please do, she said. The list Dara provided had 41 items on it. Senior analyst Koru read through it twice at the table in the Vihari briefing room, then passed it to his colleague Myra without saying anything. Myra read it. She set it down carefully, the way you set down something you are not sure you want to be holding. Koru had been a materials analyst for 19 years. He had worked joint station assignments with 4 different species. He had reviewed hazardous materials incidents involving reactor compounds, industrial solvents, and the accidental transport of a Class 6 biological irritant by a Drenathi crew member who had genuinely believed it was a food supplement. He had never seen a supply list like this. 14 of the 41 items were on the restricted list. 6 were on the prohibited list, meaning no transport without Galactic Council authorization and full containment certification. 3 of the 6 prohibited items were things the Vihari used only in deep industrial applications, under controlled atmospheric conditions, with a minimum of 2 licensed supervisors present. All 3 were in an unlocked cabinet in a corridor on Deck 9 of a joint research station. He requested a meeting with Station Commander Rail and with the senior human crew member available. Rail came. She brought a materials engineer named Theo Bart, who had thick hands and an unhurried way of talking, and who looked at the restricted list with the focused expression of someone doing a genuine review rather than a performance of cooperation. Koru began with the 6 prohibited items. He pulled the first one up on the display and explained its classification, its hazard profile, its handling requirements under Galactic Code. He spoke carefully and professionally, the way he had been trained to speak when delivering difficult information to parties who might not receive it well. Theo listened. He nodded when the compound came up on screen. White phosphorus compound, Theo said. Yes, we have that in the emergency response stores. It is part of the standard distress signal kit. Burns visible across long distances in low visibility conditions. He paused. Also used in older incendiary applications, but our kit is purely for signaling. Koru looked at him. Are you aware of its classification level? No, Theo said. I know its properties. Highly reactive with oxygen, burns intensely, difficult to extinguish with water. We keep it sealed for that reason. He thought about this. What is the classification? Prohibited Class 2, Koru said. On any Vihari vessel or installation, this compound requires atmospheric containment, remote handling equipment, and a council transport permit. Theo nodded slowly. And we keep it in a cabinet. Yes. Next to the bandages, from what I recall. Koru set down his notes. He looked at Myra. Myra was looking at the table. Rail, to her credit, said nothing. She had the practiced composure of a person who had long ago accepted that her job contained surprises. They moved to the second prohibited item, then the third. Each one followed the same pattern. Koru explained the classification. Theo knew the compound, described its properties accurately and without drama, and then looked mildly surprised when told what category it fell under. Not defensive, not dismissive, genuinely surprised in the specific way of someone who has used something routinely for years and is only now learning that the rest of the galaxy considers it extraordinary. By the fourth compound, Myra had stopped entering notes and was simply watching Theo's face. Can I ask you something? She said. Theo looked at her. These materials, she said. How did your species first identify their properties? The reactive compounds, the combustion behaviors, the penetration characteristics. Theo thought about it, trial and error mostly, over a long time. He scratched the side of his jaw. We used a lot of things wrong before we figured out how to use them right, and some things we used correctly for the wrong purposes for a while before we stopped. He looked at the display, where the list of compounds was still showing. Is that what you are asking? I think so, Myra said. The honest answer is that humans found out what things could do by doing them, Theo said. Sometimes to each other, sometimes to the landscape. The properties in that list are not theoretical for us. We found them the direct way. The room was quiet. Koru looked at the remaining items on the list. There were still 29 to go. Commander Rail, he said. Yes, Rail said. I would like to request access to every supply room and storage location on the human crew sections. I expected you would, Rail said. I have already cleared it. Koru nodded. He picked up the list. He looked at item 5. He thought, not for the first time in the past hour, that 19 years of materials analysis had perhaps not fully prepared him for this assignment. By the end of the second day, the Vahari team had reviewed 11 storage locations and cataloged 67 distinct materials of concern. Koru stopped calling them prohibited or restricted after the first morning. The categories had stopped feeling adequate. He started writing them simply as flagged, which was honest without implying he had a framework that could contain what he was finding. The thing that kept stopping him was not the individual compounds. Each one, taken alone, could be explained. A reactive metal here, a dense alloy there, a combustion accelerant stored in the maintenance supply. Explanations existed. The compounds had legitimate uses. Humans worked with difficult materials in difficult conditions and had evolved practical approaches to problems that other species solved through more refined means. The thing that stopped him was the density of it. 67 materials, in the crew sections of one mid-sized joint research station. Inaccessible, non-secured storage. Used routinely by a crew of 41 humans who, when asked about any specific item, could describe its properties with the casual accuracy of someone who had worked with it so often that the knowledge had become automatic. On the afternoon of the second day, he asked to speak with Dara Wells again. She came to the briefing room without her sample case this time, which felt notable. She sat across from Koru and Myra and folded her hands on the table with the patient posture of someone who had been answering questions for 2 days and had accepted that more were coming. Koru put a compound diagram on the display. This was found in the Deck 6 maintenance stores, a powder form sealed in a gray container. The label says Fire Suppression Training Compound. Dara looked at the diagram. That is magnesium powder. We use it in the annual fire safety training, demonstration of reactive combustion, so crew members understand why standard suppressants are not always sufficient for certain material fires. Koru looked at her steadily. Magnesium powder in this concentration and grain size is classified under Vahari Industrial Code as a restricted combustion material. It requires sealed atmospheric storage and handling gloves rated to Class 3 thermal exposure. It is in a gray container, Dara said. Yes. With a lid. Yes, Koru said. Dara thought about this. What do you use for fire safety training? Myra looked up. We use simulations, digital modeling of combustion behavior, with a physical demonstration unit that produces a contained flame at controlled temperature behind a safety barrier. Dara absorbed this. We just light it, she said. You light the magnesium powder. A small amount, outdoors or in the ventilated bay on Deck 8. She paused. It is a very good demonstration. People remember it. Myra set her stylus down. Koru pressed on. He was a professional and he intended to remain one. I want to ask you about the historical context. When your species first identified these compound properties, the combustion behaviors, the reactive characteristics, was there a formal scientific process? Dara thought carefully. For some of them, yes. The later materials, the more refined compounds. But the early ones, no. She leaned back slightly. Early human material science was mostly someone noticing that a thing did something interesting, and then doing it again on purpose to see if it was repeatable, and then writing down what happened, usually after the fact. And the weapon applications. Dara was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, more like she was deciding how much of this needed saying. We had a long period, she said, where any material that could be used as a weapon was used as a weapon. That is just honest. We were not unique in having conflicts, but we may have been particularly creative about the material side of it. She looked at the diagram on the display. Most of what you have flagged in the last 2 days was a weapon before it was anything else. We found other uses later, and the other uses are what we kept. The room was quiet. Koro thought about 67 flagged materials, each one with a history Dara had just compressed into 3 sentences. One more question, he said, and I want you to answer it directly. All right, Dara said. If you were asked to describe honestly the current human position on these materials, not policy, not official statement, what would you say? Dara thought about it for a long moment. We are aware that we carry things other species find alarming, she said. We do not find them alarming because we grew up with them. That is not the same as not respecting them. She looked at the display. We know what these things do. We have always known. The knowing is what made us careful. She paused. Most of the time. Koro wrote that last part down exactly as she said it. Most of the time. He was going to need a longer report than he had planned. The report Koro filed on day 3 was 40 pages long, which was unusual. Standard materials review reports ran 8 to 12 pages. 40 pages meant something had resisted being summarized. He transmitted it to the Vihari Council liaison and waited. The response came in 6 hours, which was also unusual. Standard review responses took 3 to 5 days. 6 hours meant someone senior had read it immediately and had opinions. The response requested a live consultation, which meant video transmission, which meant everyone was going to have to sit in the same frame and talk about this in real time, rather than through the comfortable distance of written documentation. Koro arranged the session. He sat in the briefing room with Myra. Station Commander Rail sat across from them with Theo Bart beside her. The transmission screen showed the Vihari liaison, a senior council official named Dorit, and 2 advisors Koro had never seen before, which suggested they had been brought in specifically for this. Dorit opened the session by saying that the report had been reviewed at the council level and had generated considerable discussion. Rail said she was glad it had been useful. Dorit said it had generated discussion about whether the contents of the report represented a security concern for joint station operations. Rail's expression did not change. She had been a station commander for 8 years and had the particular stillness of someone who had learned to wait for people to finish before deciding what she thought. Theo leaned forward slightly. What kind of security concern? One of the unknown advisors, older, with a careful way of holding herself, said that the concern was not about current behavior, but about baseline capacity. That the materials documented in the report represented a level of destructive potential that exceeded what had been assumed for a crew section of this classification. Theo looked at Koro. You cataloged 67 materials. Yes, Koro said. How many would you have expected to find on a station crew section? Koro considered being diplomatic. He decided Theo deserved a straight answer. Perhaps 5 to 10 in a typical mixed species installation. Materials necessary for maintenance and emergency response. The number and concentration we found was not what our models predicted. Theo nodded slowly. Our models are different, he said. We stock for a wider range of contingencies. That is apparent, Dorrit said from the screen. The session moved into the harder territory. The council wanted to understand the decision framework. Not why humans had those materials, that much was answered in the report, but how human crews made decisions about what to carry, what to store, and what counted as necessary. Rael answered this one. She said that human supply standards were built on a history of operating in environments where things went wrong in unexpected ways, that the material range reflected preparation for scenarios that might never occur, that the standard was, roughly, if there is a reasonable chance you will need it and you have space for it, you bring it. The older advisor asked what reasonable chance meant in numerical terms. Rael thought about it. Low probability, high consequence. If the consequence of not having something is severe enough, the probability threshold for carrying it goes down. How low? The advisor asked. Very low, Rael said. The advisor looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of someone doing arithmetic that was giving them trouble. Dorrit asked the question everyone had been building toward. He asked whether, given the material profile documented in the report, the Vahari Council should revise its cooperative framework for joint installations to require advanced disclosure of human supply contents. Rael said that was a council decision, and she would cooperate with whatever was decided. Theo said something different. He said, carefully and without accusation, that human crews had been operating in joint installations for 40 years, and that in 40 years no incident involving the flagged materials had occurred, and that perhaps the question the council should be asking was not whether humans were carrying dangerous things, but whether humans with dangerous things were actually dangerous. Dorrit was quiet. Myra, who had been silent throughout the session, spoke for the first time. She said she thought that was the right question. She said the report documented what was present, but it could not document what had not happened, and what had not happened in 40 years was worth examining as seriously as the supply manifest. The session ended without a resolution. These things rarely resolved in a single transmission. But after the screen went dark, Koru sat in the briefing room for a while and thought about what Theo had said. 40 years. No incident. Not because the materials were not there, but because the people carrying them had decided, consistently, not to use them. That was its own kind of data. He added a note to the report. Myra found Dara in the Deck 4 lab 3 days after the transmission session, running her friction resistance tests as if none of the previous week had happened. The lab was small and warm and smelled like hot metal. Dara was making notes by hand in a small notebook while a test rig ran cycles in the corner. She looked up when Myra came in, and her expression was neither suspicious nor particularly welcoming. It was the neutral expression of someone in the middle of work who is willing to be interrupted if the reason is good enough. Myra did not have an official reason. She had been struggling with that all morning. She had a professional reason, which was following up on the materials review, but what she actually wanted was something harder to put on a form. "Do you have a few minutes?" Myra said. Dara noted her test reading and turned around. "Yes." Myra sat on the edge of a supply bench. She looked at the test rig cycling in the corner. She thought about how to start. "I have been reviewing your species' historical material development," she said finally. "Not the classified compound specifically, the broader history, before spaceflight." Dara waited. "I found a period," Myra said, "approximately 250 years before your first contact with the Vahari, where your species had accumulated enough destructive capacity to cause significant and possibly irreversible damage to your own planet. Multiple times over." She paused. "That is not an exaggeration." "No," Dara said, "it is not." "And you did not," Myra said. Dara was quiet for a moment. The test rig clicked through another cycle. "We came close," Dara said, "more than once. There were years during that period where the question of whether we would survive the decade was genuinely open." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things. "Some of the people who were alive then have talked about it, what it felt like to not know, to have the morning news be something you were afraid to read." Myra looked at her. "How did you stop?" "We did not stop cleanly," Dara said. "We did not have a single moment where everything changed. We had a very long time of almost and not yet, and let us try this differently. A lot of things failed before things started working. A lot of people did not see the working part." She picked up her notebook, looked at it, set it down. "The honest answer is that we stopped because enough people decided that not stopping was worse than whatever they were afraid of in the first place." Myra thought about this. "The materials in your supply stores," she said, "the ones we flagged, you still carry them?" "Yes." "After all of that?" "Yes." Dara looked at her directly. "Knowing what a thing can do is not the same as planning to do it. We carry them because there are conditions where we need them and conditions where we might need them, and we have learned that being unprepared is its own kind of danger." She paused. "The Vahari use simulations for fire training. We light the magnesium. Neither of us has set the station on fire. The method is different. The outcome is the same." Myra absorbed that. "Does it concern you," Myra said, "that other species find this alarming?" Dara thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "not because I think we are doing something wrong, but because I understand why it looks the way it looks from outside. 67 flagged materials in a crew section. That is a real number. I would have questions too." She looked at the test rig. "What concerns me more is the assumption underneath the alarm. The assumption that having dangerous things means wanting to use them. That has not been our experience of ourselves." "What has been your experience of yourselves?" Myra asked. The question came out more direct than she intended, but Dara did not seem to find it strange. "A species that survived its own worst ideas," Dara said, "slowly and badly and with significant damage along the way, but still here." She looked at Myra. "That is not a small thing. We know it is not a small thing. We just do not talk about it the way it sounds when someone outside looks at the record." Myra was quiet. The test rig cycled again. She had come down here with a professional purpose. She had not expected to leave with the feeling that the most important part of the materials review had nothing to do with the materials. She thanked Dara and walked back up to the Vahari section. She sat at her desk for a long time before she opened the report file. Then she started writing a second document, a separate one, labeled Personal Observations, that was not for the council and was not for Koru and was not for anyone but her. She wrote for an hour. When she stopped, she looked at what she had written and decided it was the most honest analysis she had produced in 11 years of this work. She saved it and closed it, and did not know yet what she was going to do with it. The Vahari Council issued its formal response on a Tuesday, which was a human calendar designation that meant nothing to Koru, but which Rael mentioned when she read the transmission, in the way humans sometimes anchor important things to the ordinary grid of time. The response was not what Koru had expected. He had prepared himself for two possibilities. The first was a directive to restrict human material storage on joint installations, requiring pre-approval and containment certification going forward. The second was a prolonged review period, which was council language for "we are not ready to decide," and "our hopping the problem becomes simpler if we wait." The response was neither. The council had convened a broader review, pulling records from every joint installation with human crew participation over the past 40 years. They had cross-referenced incident reports, safety records, and materials audits from stations across 6 regions. They had looked for any event in which human-carried materials had contributed to harm, accident, or escalation. They had found 11 minor incidents involving human crew members and hazardous materials over 40 years. In 9 of those 11, The human crew member in question had been the one to identify the hazard, contain it, and report it. In 2, the incident had been caused by interaction with non-human equipment rather than human error. 0 incidents where the materials had been used against another species or crew member. 0 incidents where the presence of the materials had been used as a threat. 0 incidents where a human crew member had disclosed the materials for any purpose other than transparency during reviews, exactly like the one Koru had just completed. The Council's formal position, after 40 years of data, was that human material culture represented a significant gap in galactic understanding rather than a significant security risk. That the assumption of danger without evidence of danger was a failure of the cooperative framework rather than a feature of it. That the appropriate response was not restriction but education. Specifically, education of non-human council members and installation staff about human material norms and the historical context behind them. They recommended that Koru's report be added to the Joint Station orientation materials. They recommended that the materials review process be updated to include human consultation, rather than treating human supply manifests as anomalies to be investigated. And in a line that Koru read 3 times before accepting that it said what it said, they recommended that the galactic community consider what it meant that a species with this particular history, carrying this particular range of materials, had spent 40 years in cooperative operation with other species without a single deliberate incident. They called it an under-examined indicator of character. Koru sat in his office for a long time after the transmission. He thought about Dara Wells and her sample case and the sneeze that had started all of this. He thought about Theobart describing the properties of prohibited compounds with the comfortable accuracy of someone reciting the contents of a kitchen cabinet. He thought about Myra's face when Dara said that knowing what a thing could do was not the same as planning to do it. He thought about 67 materials and 40 years and 0 deliberate incidents. He had been a materials analyst for 19 years. His job was to understand what things were made of and what they could do. He was good at it. He had always believed that understanding material properties was the most important part of the work. He was reconsidering that. He went to find Dara Wells. She was in the Deck 4 lab again, running a new test cycle, notebook open, entirely unsurprised to see him standing in the doorway. The council responded, he said. I heard, Dara said. Rail told us this morning. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not sure what he had come to say. He had been running the same problem in his head since the morning and had not reached a conclusion he was satisfied with. The fire training, he said finally. The magnesium demonstration. Dara looked at him. Yes. Does it work? Do people actually remember it? Every single time, she said. Nobody forgets watching something burn that you cannot put out with water. It teaches the lesson in a way that a simulation does not. She looked at the test rig. The point is not the danger. The point is understanding what you are dealing with so that you respect it correctly. Koru thought about that for a while. I would like to observe the next training session, he said, if that is permitted. Dara looked at him for a moment with the calm expression she wore when she was deciding something. Yes, she said, I think that would be good. She turned back to her notebook. The test rig cycled. Outside the small warm lab, Helix 9 turned in orbit the same as it always did, carrying its crew of various species through the ordinary business of a research station, all of them sharing the same recycled air, and the same filtered corridors, and the same long project of trying to understand things that did not yet have adequate frameworks. It was, all things considered, going reasonably well.